Sure. Thanks, Sepideh, for the invitation and Foreign Object for having me today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So everyone can see that just fine. So, so this talk should go for about an hour, and I'll try to recapitulate some of the key points from two of the papers I wrote last year, with particular attention to some of the aspects of one recently published in the Koreamada book back in December. And I'll try to integrate some new directions in my research with what has been a consistent thread in my own writing and thinking for some time in terms of the relation between both art and techne and art's relays with rationality. Um, Well, I realized that the range of suggested and further readings for anyone who bothered to venture into those folders creates a kind of choose your own adventure scenario that might seem like a bit of a random grab bag of associative fervor. I think if taken together, they all sort of describe the outlines of a territory that is in no way exhaustive of the interdisciplinary problems that have influenced the history of machine learning, although the terrain itself is a kind of self-healing minefield. Um, As concerns the cartography, I intend to go a bit further afield and also deeper back in time to see what other ways there are to access the map that might go against protocol for anyone who's familiar with Brandam's analytic pragmatism or Reza Negarestani's work, for instance. As someone who's concerned with art, since I also occasionally engage in making it, I wanted to attempt to draw out how, since the release of text-to-image synthesis models, there are certain general problems of art, which, as I hope to show, are not merely problems of or for art, that seem inordinately apparent again in new ways and ought to be placed according to their relation to larger issues regarding procedures of the imagination that seem to have been offloaded onto these new tools historically by way of pattern recognition, which perhaps has been able to algorithmically decompose certain aspects of the mode of activity of the schematism that in CPR, Kant suggests nature was never likely to allow us to discover. That the schematism is in fact a problem of pattern recognition for cognition was already noted by Peter Krauser in the 1970s, although he sides with Kant regarding its mystery. Similarly, Claude Shannon, who was writing in the 50s, wagered that we were centuries away from duplicating by mechanical means what the imagination does. But perhaps 70 years' time is close enough to the mark because T2I and every other related model of generative AI, including Sora, as of this past week, has seemed to challenge this, perhaps especially with respect to a claim made early on in the analytic tradition by Nelson Goodman and then reiterated by W.J.T. Mitchell in the pictorial turn that no amount of description can add up to a depiction. Although this goes further back as the general problem of ekphrasis and the inexhaustibly recursive powers of linguistic articulation in relation to concrete particulars, when it comes to something to be generated by the machine, at least, it seems that very little description is needed to construct a depiction, accepting, of course, that what is being described in prompts is not or not yet a concrete particular. This is perhaps why the generative abilities of T2I might seem to undermine some of the familiar theoretical tools available from the teetering pile of scholarship in image theory and visual culture studies, simply because we are dealing not with just the reconstruction from code of a given image created or captured elsewhere, but with the generative techniques of representation derived from the historical development of machine learning that, as I think Matteo Pasquinelli has rightly pointed out, are also the index of a hidden labor of techniques elaborated elsewhere through social intelligence. The medium's not the screen, but the data center in this case. But as this is also a question of what those techniques might be, and for me, of what technique even is, it's my wager that another kind of interdisciplinary approach looking into what the history of machine learning and related fields of inquiry think that thinking is doing might open this problem up to a different form of articulation. And in this context of an automated imagination and its scraped or stolen data, one potential response to Mitchell's question following image theory's pictorial turn in the 1990s of what do pictures want, gleaned from contemporary critiques of big tech seems obvious, certainly nothing at all, but the adaptation of a socially engineered compulsion to be creative within data economies and their transactional patterns of behavior towards compliance with new forms of technology and power in the posthuman technosphere. This is what Yasmin Ibrahim consistently refers to as capitalism's tryst with power and the posthuman, and that our digital habits are taken advantage of through manipulation of the dark patterns of digital interface and our dispositions of mimetic behavior, and is also, I take it, what Guido Sterl has in mind when referring to these models as onboarding tools into specific technological environments. This is all continuous with Jonathan Crary's studies from the 1990s of the relentless abstractions of visual media that process the human within their dispositifs by relocating vision outside the human observer, further contributing to or even engendering the fear of a dissolution of the human. Yet, as Mitchell points out, this apparent novelty of instrumental reason that is modernism shouldn't seem like big news if it has been going on since a Renaissance perspective began rationalizing vision. But we could consider as a consequence and symptom of this anxiety or fear how we see the highlighted appearance and therefore reinforcement of saturated ideological images of what the human is taken to be, either in the exemplars of art and creativity, or some of the fantasies, dystopias, or deep time serial killer motives masquerading as altruism, being hackneyed under the moniker of Tesque Real, that are in one way or another about a certain kind of preservation rather than transformation. AI, figured as imitation or replication of human intelligence, as in the recent AI Hollywood trope of messianic propaganda in the creator, enforces through its images a persistence of liberal humanist visions of self, perhaps nowhere more evidenced than in the proliferation of stock images that, like those of people who seem unable to drink from a glass of water, as Alberto Rommel has considered, and being addressed primarily to the non-expert, present to us fantastic, childish, inaccurate, and overall distorted representations of intelligence, human or artificial. Not only do the images diminish intelligence by making it so banal, but with the exception of niche scientific applications, it has become rather apparent, especially with respect to ChatGPT, that the tools themselves have so far proven to be rather stupid. My position is somewhat ambivalent regarding the question as to whether or not these new AI models exhibit creativity, since an initial response might be, no, what they exhibit is abilities such as the ability to generate images that are presentations of techniques of representation. Yet since they rely on encoded techniques, they cannot generate techniques themselves. But this is admittedly to assume that whatever creativity is supposed to be, it might have more to do with techniques and technical abilities, which I'm willing to wager is anathema to, although not per se anathema to Kant, what are given canon or accepted interpretations of the notion of what counts as artistic subjectivity or creativity are, and why T2I models are so infuriating to many insofar as the active creative principle that undergirds artistic subjectivity in this sense abjures the constraints of techniques and the maintenance of its identity. And this is what I think provides incentive to look into the problems of techniques and their relationship to intelligence and the imagination. It is certainly an aspect of what motivates the clash between T2I users and those who make images by other means regarding what qualifies as creative behavior. This conflict, discoverable in any AI art online forum whatsoever and within the general atmosphere of social media, leads to a number of ubiquitous claims circulating in these social ecologies that rest on some basic assumptions, perhaps ossified and also widely unexamined, such as generative imagery is not art because anything creative taking place relevant to the procedures of art are to be located in life alone. Users of T2I aren't artists since they lack the practical skills and competency to otherwise produce what they are capable of recognizing and describing to the machine, perhaps according to the rules of craft, which can only copy it or imitate the authentic procedures of art. Style has some intrinsic and objectifiably identifiable attributes that could be defended in appropriate ways so as to confer upon it the mark of an inarguable intellectual property. As many have already noted, these types of claims repeat familiar historical disputes in the wake of the invention of photography, but are perhaps more symptomatic of what Andreas Reckwitz in The Invention of Creativity refers to as a creativity dispositif. This miasma, however, is another opportunity to reconsider how the creative principle disguises something about intelligence related to how what it makes gets made, or what the thinking is that enables something to be made. This has as much to do with how intelligence is pictured as with how intelligence is an interaction with the world that also does things with pictures, in the sense of both the internal and external manipulation of images, or as I want to investigate, because images and pictures are not the same to begin with, manipulations of representations, loosely defined here for now as products of the imagination's capacity of anticipation and planning. As things currently stand, it remains one of the most difficult problems for philosophy, psychology, cognitive science, neuroscience, etc., since the inception of machine learning, to provide sufficient explanation of how we even know how to do anything at all, including imagining. Since even the capacity to imagine involves techniques of perception and action, the learning and application of which are an open problem for today. The first chapter of David E. Rumelhart and James L. McClellan's seminal parallel distributed processing from 1986 sets out from this very problem of an awkward but skilled manipulation of the environment. In their example, turning a dial without knocking over a cup, the mysterious successes of which provide for them an appropriate physiological inspiration for this new paradigm, as they say. This was, of course, an engineering problem, responding to what many, and for some time, but notably Hubert Dreyfus in his 1972 manifesto, What Computers Can't Do, were highlighting as the difference between the interactive or worldly biological brain and the non-interactive disembodied computer, a problem since antiquity, even according to machine learning's timelines, of the distinctions between techne as practical engagement with the world and episteme as the lofty department of ideas. Gilbert Ryle in 1945 had famously argued for the former against the detached intellectualist tradition of the latter as that between knowing how and knowing that, a position which has since gained a great deal of traction in defense of grounded, modal, or embodied cognition as forms of skilled coping, as with Dreyfus, or even as an attempted compromise, situated normativity, to name only a few formulations 80 years on from Ryle. Yet, with recent advances in deep learning, it becomes more evident how, as Alessio Pleb and Pietro Perconti put it, this has become something of a scandal for embodied accounts of cognition, precisely because its models outperform human intelligence in myriad ways, particularly regarding the potential evidence here for relative independence from environmental and bodily cues in the processing of visual information by the brain. There's an analogous problem in predictive processing models of cognition that assumes perception and imagination share the same neural substrate that seems challenged by evidence from clinical studies of aphantasia. If it were a matter of looping this back into art, we might consider how these assumptions about imagination, perception, and embodied environmental dependencies for cultural and historical reasons underwrite claims about creativity and its know-how in particular, which, for all their variety and affirmations regarding forms of intelligence that would be impossible to algorithmically decompose, make limited strides towards articulating the knowledge of what they claim to know. To this point, for instance, and in taking fashion as an exemplar, a practice that understands a great deal of copying and imitation that Baudelaire is the appropriate critic for regarding its use of cultural schemas and stencils, Ulrich Lehmann has noted that if making is knowing, it does not follow that all makers know their craft. Or again, for Adrian Piper, who writes that, at least according to Kant's technical definition of knowledge, artists do not know what they're doing. They just do it, and allot to the critics and art historians the task of figuring out what it means and why they bothered. Piper does not exactly defend, at least in any heavy-handed sort of way, the ostensible unmediated intuitive access that the practical know-how of art often claims to have to its materials, procedures, and objects, since ultimately maintaining the semantic opacity of works of art only to prevent access to an intelligibility of the cognitive acts that gives rise to them is par for the institutionally configured course in contemporary art, and why in her early In Support of Meta Art essay from the heydays of conceptualism, she would call for artists, apropos Marx, to take the means of revelation into their own hands. Relatedly, we might consider further how the problems of skill acquisition and the articulation of the development of techniques and the relay between implicit and explicit forms of knowledge that has remained a driving force in the history of machine learning has also manifested in divides since the late 19th century between rationalism and empiricism, converging on debates that contour what Joseph Roos has referred to as the practice industry, with Heidegger and Wittgenstein as philosophical precursors. So the question for me is not per se that of what do pictures want, but rather a variation on the question that David Josselit asked following the 2002 publication of Seth Price's well-known dispersion essay, which is that of what to do with pictures in digital economies. Although, as a point of contention, I think this particular question and its critical response from Josselit risks, like Richard Serre's verbless, an attitude of simply lapsing into doing things to other things, as per the historical configuration of process art. And I would also want to distinguish my questions from, say, Trevor Paglen's of how to intervene into digital images when the human is left out of the loop. Although I would say my interests are nonetheless compatible with what he identifies as a task of unlearning to see like humans, if perhaps in an inverted form of that question for that task. And this is because I think, what does it mean to even see like humans remains an open one, and then unlearning towards what kind of seeing. If we're only unlearning in order to conceptually access the turtled ontology, Jussi Parikka's self-fashioning terminology, not mine, of an abstract operationality all the way down so as to lament the infinite regress of its panoptic reign, this does not necessarily imply that we've gained any traction on understanding what vision, imagining, or perception entail to begin with in the human sphere, which is left assumed and from which this is said to alienate us. In fact, it invites these questions as not merely the identification of a new type that the computational paradigm extracts and makes abstract concrete, but of the construction of type as among more perennial problems of imagination and its procedures. An ontology about things that are images or not, that do things, and things that are forms of vision about data, about aspects and features of images and perceptions of the world, has the irony of being a description of the imagination while trying to point to computational processes as something that are its other. So even if, according to Jean-Pierre Vernant, the psychological career of the image isn't exactly opened up in Plato in any direct way, since by his reading we don't find the contours of an idea of the imagination recognizable to us until the end of the 2nd century our era, Plato's sophist nonetheless seems an appropriate starting point for reasons that might seem obvious. Obvious not just for its introduction of an art of deception regarding images and how the sophist also creates images with words, but because the dialogue represents a major shift in which it became possible to think of images proper as an autonomous category. With respect to this, as translator Benjamin Jowett remarks in his rightly lengthy introduction to this dialogue, we have come to understand only mistakenly the figure of the sophist as the enemy of philosophy, whereas philosophy's true enemy in Plato is instead the world. This is why, perhaps, with its Parmenidean dialectic of being and non-being, it is not without significance that 2 years after Heidegger's lecture course on the sophist, his magnum opus of Being and Time would directly follow, a relation to this ancient text that surely can be said to extend into his treatment of Kant's schematism and Kant and the problem of metaphysics 2 more years later in 1929. Heidegger's move, already anticipated in German Romanticism, is to explicitly subordinate reason to the imagination, wherein the productive imagination is figured as the very source and resource of freedom in the capacity of its spontaneous shaping powers to produce determinations of time as the very and exclusively empirically apprehended gap that the cognitive function of schematization opens up between the phenomenal and the nominal. Within this, I think it becomes fairly difficult to understand why imagination would become, ought to be, or is central to the projects of freedom and autonomy if we are constrained by a terminological bulwark wherein thinking is figured as a spontaneous creative force or activity. Stanley Rosen introduces some useful provocations in his essay on the question of spontaneity and of thinking as it appears in Kant, as it seems to appeal to this notion of the activity of thought more as something closer to what might now be termed an anticipatory model or cognitive search function for the appropriate rules, rather than something unruly in any truly mysterious way. Were this to be viewed from an information theoretic perspective, we might say, as Kevin G. Kirby has submitted, that as living stuff, the functions of cognition would probabilistically diagonalize out of any fixity or capture by its own constructed representations, which do not themselves adapt or develop, but can only be changed by an exterior technical intervention. The problem of spontaneity is actually a very difficult and real one that cannot simply be rejected to court. But we ought to be able to constrain the use of the term, which is to the point of Rosen's intervention. Although there could certainly be more to say about how Rosen has an ambivalence to Kant's project, while it remains almost entirely within the ambit of its language, especially with respect to what it, as Rosen puts it, is a defensive poetry over epistemology on Kantian grounds that are perhaps nowhere more evident in Kant than in the schematism chapter of CPR or in his definition of genius. But it would be important to note that even for Kant, thought's unruly deviation from rules, that is the spontaneous activity of the thinking subject's autonomy, is not in fact identical with, as Kant puts it, a total absence of bounds and rules, as it marks the passage to a construction of new rules. Genius, in fact, has far humbler origins and its obsolete definition as disposition that might even come closer to what is at stake in the problem of know-how, which Kant does not exactly attend to given the jettisoning of technoterms from his project, which might help to explain how this absence of bounds, which is determined by Kant to only be an assumed freedom of the apers, nonetheless comes to be the canon interpretation of freedom, or at least artistic freedom, as antithesis to reason for artistic modernism. We could still juridically find Kant at fault with attention to how the approach to mechanism within his project defers this activity of the thinking subject to the processes of a technics of nature. Peter Fens has provided a noteworthy meta-commentary on this very problem by way of an essay from Samuel Weber regarding the ambivalent demarcations of disciplinary and institutional configurations in relation to reflective judgment in the third critique, where Weber suggests a possible deregulative idea Kant never mentions but implicates, according to the principles of thinking and cognition as organic development, change, or transformation. With respect to Kant's texts, what is at issue is how empirical reality seems to already be an ordered display of appearances in some way prior to the act of cognition that only cognizes according to an ordering procedure, spontaneously assembling disparate and partial representations, importantly names and terms, from an ambiguous or indeterminate intuition. The world must therefore be approached as if there were an order there, other than any we put there, based on the understanding as guided by a fictionally posited form of understanding that, even if it must resemble ours, we do not ourselves understand, which is how thinking comes to be not guided by rules in this sense. With this sleight of hand, genius can therefore only be figured as the medium that does not itself generate any resulting novelties, as its novel appearances result from the spontaneity of a productive imagination that functions through a techniques of nature, which technique, at least as it is generally understood as Fens notes, must give way to so as to act without direction of old rules. As a consequence, thinking, in its search for the appropriate rules, has no navigator, and neither does nature, where, in Fens' reading, it is no longer possible to say with conviction that we are familiar with our own kind of understanding. However, even as an appropriate vector of alienation, localizable in Kant's phrase, the thing that thinks, where thinking becomes separate from nature or separate from the brain as an unstructured structuring, rather than a constructed constructor feeding itself chunks of purposed meat and spitting out purposed sausage, as in the practical spiritual automaton of Sellers, the trade-off here, qua romanticism, is a distortion of our understanding for the imagination, of the imagination by way of its opposition to rationality. For Rosen, at least, this leads to a chaos at the expense of an explanation of what it is we actually do when we think. Even if this new metaphysics of nature opened up by Kant was abandoned by science in the 19th century, with vitalist residues in the 20th, it was retained by philosophy and art, from which our contemporary understandings of creativity and even the conceptually related term of emergence, now the catchword for AGI evangelists, are largely derived. It might seem like old hat to note how all of our modern and contemporary understandings of originality and creativity are bound up in this logic underwritten by the artistic subject and their creative force upon matter that purports to make visible the separation of material and appearance. Or if we were really to allow art to gain traction on this problem, the disturbance between two kinds of belief: perceptual experience as ostensibly added information and non-inferential belief from observation. Yet if generative computation is only a synthetically generic copy of this freedom of thinking, it should here be highlighted that the logic of copying as a thing one is not supposed to do tends to only hold water within this fairly recent system of aesthetics, where originality is manufactured as a concept of art for which technique could only be the handmaiden. Although he was writing only of techniques of poetry at the time, but in relation to mental imagery, as Russian literary critic Viktor Shklovsky observed in his 1917 essay, Art as Technique, what appears to us as novelty is typically the appearance only of a reconfiguration of known appearances. That appropriation and copying actually serves as a better explanation of style than original compositions is something Jan Backlund has recently explored as the paradox of style as a concept in art, with respect to how style only begins to make sense as a cultural item since the mid-19th century, and takes shape as the index of an author function of the individual who themselves must, paradoxically, in order to generate anything sufficiently resembling a style, utilize and copy numerous existing styles, synthesizing and integrating them into, quote, the summation of images plus an executable meta layer that encapsulates that visuality, end quote. Backlund's algorithmic reading takes some liberties with Lev Manovich's The Database as Symbolic Form, but I would maintain there is already an analogous argument to be found in Ernst Gombrich from his Art and Illusion as the relational model of schema and correction, where the will to form is rather a will to make conform, the assimilation of any new shape to the schemata and patterns an artist has learned to handle, and further that you cannot create a faithful image out of nothing. You must have learned the trick if only from other pictures you've seen. Imitation is, after all, at the very origins of techniques themselves. We are only homo faber because we are first homo mimeticus. As Merlin Donald has explored, imitation in human societies only evolved as a consequence of its embedding in social interactions and communication as precisely a problem of lower level cognitive functions of pattern recognition that were developed and then deployed at a larger scale that could, quote, link the evolution of imitation with the emergence of gesture, mime, and skill, end quote, that Donald sees as a universal mimetic tendency to conform to the norms of our milieus. Gombrich here provides the Kantian lens through which to consider cognition as already reliant on a data set of sorts, where we can't assume the composition of images as some novel configuration that can be entirely distinguished from a statistical variation of known concepts and schemas, trying to fulfill what in contemporary parlance we might understand as a satisfaction of correctness criteria according to norms. In a tangential way, this echoes André Leroi-Gourant's archaeological investigation in gesture and speech that connects the evolution of techniques with that of language, and the freeing of the hand through the evolutionary niche that changed the constraints of the spine towards upright posture. And insofar as the hand was no longer mediated by the ground, now the gravitational enslavement of the feet alone, it could develop into a syntax of gesture that would ultimately lead to the syntax of artificial memory systems as we now understand them. The exemplar here, adopted as well by Bertrand Gill in his massive history of techniques, is that of the Middle Paleolithic Lavoie napping technique. Since it is so counterintuitive, it would almost certainly have required linguistic articulation in order to permit its dissemination to stone tool industry, as it elaborates a technique to make a tool where the tool ends up as a source of other tools. It is for these reasons that imitation gives way to forms of replication and reproduction, which is the problem of the ambivalence towards techniques observed in Kant by Fens and Weber, where technique is also said to give way to another kind of techniques that ultimately creates within aesthetics the fundamental problem of technical appearances, that in their formation as aesthetic ideals and reflective judgment presuppose another formation structurally the same. In Fenn's words, apparatuses in and through which they can take place as such. So a contemporary question such as what to do with pictures is both a problem of how the imagination can apprehend and understand images as affordances in the digital environment, and how there are at the same time technical formations of techniques of seeing for this apprehension that are used to determine their possible actions. Prairie's point in Techniques of the Observer, that one who sees is only capable of doing so within a determinate set of prescribed possibilities of, quote, the plural forces and rules composing the field in which perception occurs, end quote, could not make Foucault's influence regarding the relation between the visible and the articulable more apparent. This relation also orients the work of art historian Richard Neer, who, in his Conditions of Visibility, for instance, cites Panofsky's example of Rogier van der Weyden's The Vision of the Magi, so as to reiterate that it is only within the context of having learned certain schemas of iconographic information that what is seen will appear as either a floating messiah or a baby hurled from a catapult. If there is indeed an agency to art, it would have to be within this ambit of confusing the perceiver about what they think they know. However, this relation is perhaps why, in the historical distance separating us from Panofsky's analysis of images, and even concerning those of a non-objective variety where content should supposedly replace convention, in the context of social media, the distribution of images of artworks has all become conventions and motifs in our era, and in a manner validating the constructivism of Gombrich. There is no innocent eye, like the Impressionists saw it, simply because there is a reading of images, that is, of picturing appearances, describing them in some way to ourselves, more so today than ever, that constitutes a pictorial attitude where perception of the visual field involves an intrinsic norm or conventions of seeing. The historical epistemology of Marx Bortowski provides the example of how the introduction of linear perspective and pictorial representation led to an alteration in the conditions of appearance, such that when we now say, look at a cup resting on a table, we represent its circular form as elliptical in order for it to appear to us as circular. Wartowski insists that even to understand what Helmholtz meant by an unconscious inference, for which today we have the derivation of implicit bias, any appeals to looking and seeing simply by way of the perceptual system will not suffice in order to comprehend the activity of seeing something as something. That the perception of an image, or at least the experience and imagination of an image in the absence of particular referent, was an empirical problem of, say, measurable blood flow to area 17 of the brain, correlating imagining with neural activations in the visual cortex, as in Stephen Koslin's work, rather than a conceptual one of descriptive and representational contents and processes no different in principle from the propositional content of linguistic articulation as initiated by Zenon Pilchun's critical interventions beginning in the 1970s, introduced certain aporias regarding any purported unmediated form of perception and imagination that characterized these mental imagery debates. Pilchun, writing much later in 2003, closes out one of his many contributions to these debates with a story credited to Wittgenstein regarding the Copernican revolution that seems germane to what is at issue. This problem is of particular interest because, unlike the introduction of linear perspective, from which there is no turning back in our picturing ellipses so as to see circles, as Paul Churchland put it, our eyes remain in bondage to not seeing the Copernican revolution. As a defense of the plasticity of perception, Churchland provides the example of entertaining certain perceptual transformations, such as merely tilting our heads in conceptual disregard of how things otherwise appear. Unlearning to see like humans, as it turns out, is a far more complicated task than we might assume. These hypothetical transformations of what Churchland refers to as embodied or modeled interpretation functions of perception that have become encoded and learned through development and social interaction to which it would be an empirical question for him as to whether we are the unwitting victims of an inappropriate set of such functions, are not unlike what Andy Clark, borrowing from the post-Piaget neuroconstructivism of Annette Karmeloff-Smith in his 2013 essay, In Defense of Explicit Rules, refers to as representational redescriptions concerning our actual abilities to regularly engage in, quote, transferring the abstract principles used to solve one kind of problem to a related but different kind of problem, end quote. And in Clark's example, when children are asked to draw a funny house or a man with two heads. What is of interest and of further interest because of T2I models is how drawing, describing, and depicting are actually cognitive procedures that cannot quite be disentangled. As Kant already understood the constructive procedures of intuition to entail, if one wants to picture a line, you would need to draw it in imagination. Wartofsky, in fact, insists that the visual manual skill of drawing the ellipse in accordance with the laws of perspective is directly related to seeing it in terms of such a representation. His point being, as the point of an historical epistemology, that modes of perception are related to modes of action that are themselves historically variable, such that we cannot naturalize the imagination if what the imagination is and how we perceive are conditions that we change through practice, which places perception within other categories of historical transformation, in spite of what we might otherwise consider to be invariants of the meaty substrate supporting the sensory system. I find this argument a bit more compelling than Brandam's chicken sexers or Grivey wand wavers towards what is consequential and what Sellers isolated as locating objects in a space of implications regarding human praxis. In the sense expressed by Wartofsky here, perceptual and epistemological transformations occur outside the head. That is, in public language and social practice, which recalls how Rosen, without directly naming it, also draws attention to perception's diachronicity in pointing out that, quote, concepts have objective meaning only because we have understood something about the world, including ourselves as thoughtful residents in it. That is, not merely as products of the activity of thinking, end quote. In both cases, the objects of perception are in fact treated as artifacts of cognition in this sense, and artifacts, pace Wartofsky, may be any artifact, including language and even skills themselves, which become artifacts when detached and internalized to represent forms of action as images of the action for the planning and execution of techniques. This is also to acknowledge that we cannot disentangle technical activity from human activity in general, and that a dimension of normativity, however much in the background, is likely at play in perception as the rules composing its field. This provides some justification for polemicizing certain tenets of embodied cognition and significantly J.J. Gibson's original theory of affordances as perception in the environment that enable the detection of information put to use by intentional action, that rejects any significant relation between perception and the imagination. Since for Gibson, affordances are figured as directly perceived, they're ontic facts rather than appearances, as though the abilities and skills associated with acting on an affordance cannot or would not have the need for a detached or conceptual relation to them, wherein their function as affordances to which we apply know-how is assessed prior to or alongside their skilled appropriation in perceptual motor activity, or as Gibson put it, you do not have to classify and label things in order to perceive what they afford. But this is to assume that we would not need to see things as something before acting in accordance with what they afford, such that when reaching for a cup, we shouldn't be expected to see it as either elliptical or as a cup, but only as the thing over there that affords drinking, but also without the addition of any such propositional content in the perception. While Gibson's anti-cognitivism is perhaps certainly more nuanced, it nonetheless seems to provide only the vague horizon of a conceptless and prehensile interaction with the world that rejects the possibility that affordances could be a relation between abilities and environmental features, which would open them to normative and conceptual content, as has been argued by Anthony Camero and Eric Reichfeld, among others. The argument being that, considered within a wider social context, affordances require abilities in order to act on them, which themselves entail correctness criteria concerning the right or wrong ways of doing things. The rebuttal from Dreyfus would be that what separates us from animals is that we instead transform our unthinking, non-conceptual engagement towards new thinkable structures. In any case, there are a number of arguments like for or against this position that I think are just have to be left on the sidelines. But it nonetheless provides an interesting provocation, especially in the context of what Tamar Zavo Gendler refers to as A-leafs, that are a kind of inverse gut response to affordances taken to be norm and sensitive, spontaneous or automatic motor routines and affective states more primitive than either imagination or beliefs, that short circuit beliefs in the imagination and normative interaction. In their examples, brownies shaped like turds or anxiety regarding the safety of glass walkways. However, the key point of a disequilibrium that's introduced by A-leaves between reflective and automatic behavior or belief is the ability to update and perform self-modification, as opposed to acting in the world like thermostats and plants that merely respond automatically. As Michael Brownstein and Alex Mavda have attempted to show in a manner similar to Camaro, the fact that A-leaves can fail by providing inaccurate information shows that they are not ballistic causal reflexes, but legitimately norm-sensitive responses, which are, no matter well, always capable of getting things wrong. There's a sense in which Gilbert Ryle's classic argument about the difference between know-how and knowing that is aimed at precisely this problem, where he affirms an image of practical activity against the detachment of intellectualism that, were it to be allowed, would submit an absurdity by way of the claim that skillful action could be accompanied by a secondary set of shadowy operations of repeating to oneself the rules of the action and the performance, as this would otherwise overwrite spontaneity, as in Rosen's terms, an antecedent deliberation. To do so would be to interrupt the action, returning the skilled expert to the rank of a beginner who hasn't yet learned to forget the rules in order to know how to do something. Again, the gist of the historical dispute between symbolic AI and connectionism is within this dynasty of problems that has no limit to how far back it goes. Whatever indeterminacy there might be between forms of knowledge here is more of an indication that our navigation of the environment is not in fact norm insensitive, and a reminder of the warning Sellars gave that to live without rules is to risk suddenly finding ourselves to be walking on 4 feet. This comes down for Rosen to how we must admit that the activity of thinking separates us from what we think about, as we would otherwise not be conscious of what we do. It's this separation which is at the origin of techniques and practices, since these can arise only to the extent that the separation occurs, and what permits talk about thinking and imagination as exaptations, rather than higher cognitive functioning merely developing from social interaction and adaptations within any contingent evolutionary niche. Exaptation is, in its general definition, the emergence of a feature derived from something's current function that comes to be used for another reason, such as in T. Ryan Gregory's example of when coins come to find a common alternative use as a scratch lottery tool. A specific advantage derived from the functional shift or refunctionalization of properties outside of what they were designed for, but that he refers to, after Francois Jacob, as a kind of bricolage or tinkering with functions. But this tinkering is not simply a responsive mechanism of evolutionary biology, precisely because the context of human intelligence is social and performs and elicits such behaviors that are irreducible to the biological condition. Mimetic behavior, imitation of techniques, deviation of the function of tools derived from these techniques, and therefore the invention and systematization of new techniques that also would have been impossible without language in order to teach and explain them. That higher order reasoning in all likelihood arose from heuristic exaptations has already been suggested by a number of different authors whose work has been consolidated and distilled by Antonio Mastrogiorgio et al. In their essay More Thumbs and Rules, that attempts to outline the current state of the art of human rationality, as they put it, as a form of embodied rationality that has redeployed the perception action system by tinkering. Here it's really a problem of how the evolution of cognition comes to have a stake in higher order functioning outside of its biological development with respect to the constraints of lower level abilities exapted towards what we understand to be the faculty or capacity of the imagination. This exaptation is precisely what defines causal cognition as a modality of explorations, orientations, and predictive motivations through an awareness of abilities or dispositions of objects in the environment, or importantly, the manufacture of hidden variables as cognitive artifacts that enable us to model other minds as things because they are recognized in their likeness to our own minds. It is the construction of such representations as upholding counterfactual conditionals or gnomic regularities, exhibiting what Dennett would call a real pattern in the world, that end up providing cognition with a kind of toolbox for vocabulary for tinkering with foresight and anticipation. The authors here also draw generously on the notion of mental time travel developed by Thomas Suddendorf and Michael C. Corballis as a function of imagination, structurally not vastly different from that of Kant's, that enables planning of remote futures, one say, where a particular tool might be required, thus setting up the conditions for rules for future use. Interestingly, as a development in the cognitive arms race, Suddendorf and Corballis note that the technological inventions of humanity, or sapiens, may have actually played only a secondary Promethean advantage to the social situations in which modern humans, quote, use their planning capacities extensively to cooperate with, deceive, and manipulate conspecifics, end quote. We could perhaps leave to one side that this is a rather myopic view of technology, since it does not seem to recognize its particular use of capacities to also be a technology. This is precisely to the point of their influence from Peter Gardenford's with respect to what he has explored as detached representations, that is, picturing or modeling in the absence of direct stimuli, or utilizing this detachment for whatever adds information to stimuli, as he would put it, if only to add to the ambiguity between images, pictures, or descriptions. For Gardenford, these representations need not be a picture in the mental image sense, or even conceptual, certainly as the capacity applies to the anticipatory behavior of non-human animals. Such detachment, which is not isomorphic with the Rylean critique of intellectualism or Gibson's anti-cognitivism, serves a function for what might in another sense be called exapted affordances. That is, it permits the apprehension of causation in the environment, which gives the world a sense of hidden meaning, of unobservables that serve more abstract cognitive processes of planning, and indeed the potential of deception, essentially forming a mode of separation from the environmental situatedness that Gardenford sees as the condition for self-awareness and precisely the kind of recall needed to practice a skill. This is ultimately what enables intelligence to recursively generate its symbols, tools, or images, and in its intrinsic relation to techniques, it is also entirely likely that art came about because of tinkering with cognition itself, so as to reuse cognitive functions that evolutionarily serve different purposes, such as exacting lower level abilities of pattern recognition towards a deviation of higher level communicative functions. In fact, this has already been suggested by neuroscience that art is an instinct-like behavior of communication by symbols that exacts and redeploys certain brain areas, such as von Economo's neurons, that are thought to be involved in no small way in both self and social awareness. Drawing on the work of Samuel Forsyth, we could even consider art as a form of what he terms adversarial rationality in certain of its contemporary manifestations, as the mobilization of lying through visual content, where lying is a purposeful act of pretending to provide information. Since art presupposes a theory of mind, a model of the perceiver who will look for certain kinds of information which in fact are not there, only the trap of the techniques leading them to respond in specific ways or that exploit conventions of behavior and understanding. Propaganda works analogously and much in the same way as games, as a purposeful reorientation of imagination to interact with artificial scenarios and simulations or events. In order to extend this, we might have to note how thinking requires a focused manipulation of multiple technical components, where the technical components can be other minds, that would define a technological symbiosis, as evidenced in human history by Gardenford and Marlise Lombard with the exaptation of bow and arrow technology. These functional deviations that separate out the abilities of objects and combine and and the combinations of operations are in general how we come to have games to begin with, and how we elaborate techniques so as to also turn tools into weapons, which by way of oral history, story, narrative, discourse, provide us with the curious objects that are weapons of lore. An artifact such as creativity, that in no way has any supernatural properties but develops an aura, since the lore that confers its aura is a product not only of how it was made, but of what can be done with it, of what arcane arts can be practiced based on a heuristic exaptation of functions and their endless combinations. As a concrete example, the farming scythe is one such object, stereotypically associated along with the pitchfork to angry mobs of peasants. Incidentally, Maure here, who was an aristocrat, is thought to have included these illustrations among other legitimate techniques and weaponry as a joke about peasants. The tool proves rather unwieldy in medieval fandom simulated combat scenarios, and the actual war scythes historically would have been crafted from refitting the blade at 90 degrees, but we nonetheless get the transmission and culture of the farming scythes as a weapon of lore. As is also the case with propaganda, such technical and cultural elaboration is at the core of what lends artworks their aura, and is the source as well for Benjamin's ambivalence towards technics in Fenn's reading, an ambivalence regarding the incompatibility of an aesthetic idea with the transmissibility of techniques, and the paradox that the aura, in fact, thrives within techniques rather than declines. This would have to do by extrapolation with how the maintenance of aura is itself a technique that safeguards the creative principle and is predicated on the disguise of that principle's technical configurations that would reveal it as separated out from what it claims to be involved with. This reading is rather intentionally against Badiou, who doesn't understand art to be a technical dispositif, which is a claim that seems to contradict his articulation of configurations, their reactivation of tendencies, or the truth procedure more generally. Although the degree of requisite separation remains contested as how much of thought is entirely in the head, when we think of technique, we tend to be in the domain of cognitive capacities of detached intellectualism, which, so the story goes, can't be coextensive with know-how. Technique can be transmitted and learned, and therefore, according to Kant, is merely imitation. In the collaborative work of Giovanni Bazzullo and Cristiano Castelfranchi, this has been discussed according to the symbol detachment problem, that of how detached representations don't by necessity lose their aboutness or intentionality as one might purely amodal syntax. As an offline and covert mental simulation of actions for the purposes of manipulating representations instead of the environment that are relays between modal and amodal representations, where there is assumed to be a multimodal overlapping of the performance, observation, simulation, or imitation of actions, is considered by them to be a prerequisite for goals. And their slogan, thinking, is an exaptation of anticipating. In another sense, this would recall how the construction of images of actions transforms skills into cognitive artifacts for Wartofsky. Such conceptual entities can be used offline by the agent as representations, actually reasoning at a different level of abstraction, as would be the case with abstractions that move to the level of types or tokens. However, the author's claim in this case is that since these run parallel to the sensory motor loop, they are still grounded, so modal rather than amodal. These accounts nonetheless contribute to what Lambros Malafouris refers to as brain artifact interfaces. Yet they reproduce a problem he, I think, correctly sees arising with much of situated cognition's claims, and that they remain trapped inside the biological boundaries of the individual. Yet Malafouris constructed is it me or is it mine scenarios where he cites Emily Vermeule's "there's a sense that the weapon is partly alive," only provides this jackknife to situated cognition to advance his concept of brain artifact interfaces as capable of structurally rewriting neural pathways by honing sensory motor functions and attention through a socially distributed development that itself risks overextending a repackaged vitalism in its integration of the Heideggerian ready to hand with the Deleuzian assemblage and the familiar trope of a creative evolution of human becoming. And perhaps the same could be said regarding other aspects of what is being discussed here that might risk overextending the role of imagination for intelligence when considered in its prioritization of an embodied repertoire for a general sensory motor agency, to use Pietro Montani's terminology. The pivot here in all of this disciplinary expanse towards embodied cognition and its justified response to the algorithmic captures of computationally represented techniques, in fact, may obscure the relation of thinking and technique to amodal abilities by instead determining thought in diametric opposition to representationalism or computational theories of mind as something that, as Malaforis put it, can no longer be justified or tolerated. In pointing out the distinction between rule-governed and rule-obeying behavior, proponents of embodiment have on occasion had recourse to citing a line from Sellars that, quote, "the mode of existence of a rule is a generalization written in flesh and blood, or nerve and sinew, rather than in pen and ink," end quote. Yet in stressing the embeddedness of rules in practical action, where grounded cognition must forget that it is using them, this can elide their inscription at the level of the social, where they are linguistically, conceptually, and representationally articulated through the very understanding of what a practice even is, insofar as it can become a practice and be understood. But this would no doubt have to include various formal and material inscriptions that also can no longer be justified or tolerated, such as the artist's active creative principle, which cannot be a private language because, apropos the argument for causal cognition, insofar as art is a practice and a form of thought, it cannot merely be concerned with what or why an individual performs such and such activities or techniques in certain ways, but with why others also do things in certain ways. In his study of cultural techniques, Bernhard Siegert brings our attention to what Fens and Weber might also be said to acknowledge as the techniques of the institutional frame, but with a renewed interest in demarcating levels of organization and its function as a system. And the fact that art is a system is also what enables fakes, forgeries, imitation, and mimicry to obtain so strongly as techniques of the system. And we could also spend hours discussing how AI is now being used to authenticate works, to say nothing of the general art historical and museological interest in replication and copies. Siegert's analogous here, where creativity is not at the beginning of the work, but rather, quote, at the end of a protracted disciplinary process that imposes discursive rules on and codes the relationship between hand and eye, end quote, should not in any way be unfamiliar from the history of art if we consider institutional critique or post-conceptual practices, questions of the archive, the problems of art and its relation to labor, the notion of artistic research, etc., and brings to mind prior to the identity of art as we understand it today from its invention in the 18th century, what was anticipated, as Neil Mulholland has shown, through the liberal arts and art academies since they appeared in the 16th century, that have gradually displaced techna, or technical knowledge, into the various diglossic dimensions of discourse on art and the training of artistic subjects. This is why I would claim the separation between art and techna, or art and craft, or art from handiwork, is an arbitrary one insofar as the teaching and learning of art as a skill is concerned, where technique is functionally displaced, or rather redeployed, to align with the visibility of gestures performed in the space of general social technique and its rules of form. Roos would refer to this as the niche construction of conceptually articulated discursive practices, wherein even if we were to consider or defer to the instantaneous judgments of a skillful response to patterns in creative activity, such that an explicitly conceptual relation is not a requirement, the procedures themselves must be, as Roos puts it, informed by and accountable to the conceptually articulated norms of the game. That we are involved in intuitive heuristic methods as practitioners in whatever discipline is perhaps less significant than how these implicit forms of knowing become both materially and conceptually articulated into new sets of rules and functional deviations of artifacts, cognitive or otherwise, even if this encoding is involved in a process of cultural techniques, uniting the will to create with the will to conquer, as Siegert put it, since at least according to Adorno, art mobilizes technique in an opposite direction than does domination, or at least it might. In acknowledging how social processes unfold production, consumption, and waste in myriad forms, we might look to linguist Roger Lass, who, in his influential essay, How to Do Things with Junk, was interested in how language change utilizes exaptation when considering the jettisoning of grammatical distinctions, and provides three options that might become available. It seems more than appropriate to state that with respect to three, whatever art does in its doings, it analogously takes junk features of schemas and copies and integrates them, which is essentially Nelson Goodman's thesis on world making, how formal or pictorial features are highlighted and exaggerated elsewhere outside of their conventional mode of appearance. I think if we were looking for a key text in the visual arts that sort of encapsulates how art is consistently performing this procedure, I would repeat Seth Price's dispersion essay from 2002, where, quote, production after all is the excretory phase in a process of appropriation, end quote. We would have to admit that the overwhelming majority of images in the data set for AI and what it generates are in fact junk, as are the overwhelming majority of our perceptions, intuitions, imaginings, etc. But the mind, or at least the brain, as part of nature, is what William Wimsatt would call a backwoods mechanic and used parts dealer that opportunistically favors results, using any method that is cost effective, as, quote, causally and phylogenetically prior to our algorithmic abstractions, end quote. But these abstractions also become used parts that can be put to new use. Machine learning is an interdisciplinary collage and assemblage of sometimes disparate images of the biological brain. And any critical and pragmatic account of what machine learning is would need to acknowledge that research into AI-generated imagery ought to be as much about investigating how the computer sees as it would be about integrating existing models of human cognition, vision, and meaning. The experimental methods suggested by Deleuze and Guattari, which include those of mimicking the strata, might even seem attractive again in this light, however too late they were, since for them, and taking a healthy amount of inspiration from Leroy Gourand, as I no doubt have, there is no imagination outside of technique. Getting back the cognitive loot taken by the machine will unlikely be accomplished in court cases over intellectual property, but in the patterns of adjustment that exact and steal back for intelligence what machine learning's understanding of creativity is, in a first move to dispense with the phlogiston of what we culturally and normatively take creativity to be, because we are not worse off if we consider machine learning for what it might possibly tell us about how humans actually think and act creatively, much in the same way that for Helmholtz, our unconscious inferences are not fully hidden, since it is possible to become consciously aware of them. To return to Wittgenstein's question mentioned by Pilschen, but what would it look like if it looked like the Earth was rotating, is within the same dynasty of problems shared by Nier, Foucault, or Vernant, where it is both a question for us of what is it like to see an image and what is it impossible to think. As a distal goal for intelligence to resolve such ambiguities, we might again align with Churchland, who asks, quote, if our perceptual judgments must be laden with theory in any case, then why not have them be laden with the best theory available, end quote. This would provide the potential of an opportunity and an occasion to develop what he refers to as a new cognitive taxonomy. But then, as with Ryle's intervention, we would have to admit that we might never start thinking or acting if thought or action had to wait for the regulative proposition of their activities to begin in the first place. Since if no one possessed any money, no one could get money on loan, as he put it, because according to this stance, applying is an exercise of intelligence, but not an exercise of propositions. Yet this particular analogy is empty to the extent that not having something is the condition upon which capitalism's endless solicitation to possess something one does not have is predicated, which is perhaps why we so often feel faced with something we both don't possess and also do, namely freedom, for which creativity is the appropriate update to the operating system of late capitalism's marketing campaign. If only because, like money, as a principle of justification for liberal behavior, it is a well-honed fiction, but at least a functional one that, like the activity of thinking itself, as Rosen had it, is, quote, the passport by which we cross the boundary between one set of rules and another, end quote. Of course, We cannot use the passport towards anything, any place, horizon, or transformation without the techniques and heuristics exacted from rules that are used to transit between other rules, as there would be nowhere to arrive to or return to, and the cognitive system would otherwise remain lost in thought. Deviation from rules is a necessary but insufficient condition for freedom, and a reminder of one of Althusser's lessons derided by Rancière, that those who don't follow any rules are the ones trapped worst of all. And to hear truly bastardized Sellars, this would be an entrapment when spontaneity, if taken as an active creative principle of the cognitive system, might only deliver us to a state that it is not caused to be in by anything other than itself. That we would even have to tilt our heads in the first place to see the Copernican revolution in disregard of given conceptual understanding in obtaining a perspectival shift on the other side of bondage is to truly abide by what Plato meant by carving nature at the joints, instead of it's to use the joints function for another purpose and another nature, as something that would involve, to borrow Clarke's formula, quote, a speculation concerning a link between the ability to become consciously aware of the contents of our own mental states and the process of redescription, end quote. The problem itself is not unlike that of Wittgenstein's duck rabbit, since one would need to transit by way of passport between the phenomenal and nominal without their synthesis being at all possible to hold together in one and the same thought. We might then not merely detect as in a current perceptual belief, but begin instead to construct different details through this process of aspect seeing that draws and arranges things differently with respect to the overall image that is connected in any case by all the same lines that have, importantly, no necessity to their arrangement. Wittgenstein's example is instructive insofar as it can add to the description of a process for what I take Nathan Brown to have in mind regarding a provisional objectivity with respect to the methodology suggested by Gaston Bachelard of a rationalist empiricism, and that such an operation, as he put it, suspends objects in the medium of construction, in a manner that is also social, since that medium involves technical apparatuses as a coextensive determination of an outside that redeploys, quote, the power of thought to think beyond its own conditions, end quote. If here, the imagination plays some fundamental role in the project of autonomy and freedom, but we are compelled to remain incapable of linking its actions due to an affective rejection of their articulated understanding and elaboration, as Reza Nagaristani would have it, we might as well replace the human with whatever we wish, even vegetables or barometers. Keeping in mind that, concerning such constructive hypotheses and their exaptive potentials, principles of innovation and principles of exclusion very often go hand in hand, insofar as maintaining the integrity of existing systems is concerned. Technique and imagination have more often than not served the opposite of freedom, if only perhaps unwittingly. We know this not simply from the history of modernity, but find its evidence as well in the archaeological record. As archaeologist Colin Renfrew commented around the time of the 1972 discovery of the Varna necropolis, the deepening of skill will be coextensive with the embedding of social hierarchies, where in the case of the advance of metallurgy, techniques serve not the purpose of utility, but of conspicuous display. And by extension, as noted by Leroy Goron, technique as captured and exploited by those who apprehend and anticipate another form of invention has led to the continuation of a frustration intuitively felt by humans from the earliest times. While we cannot, as of yet, attribute a reasoning agency to these extant disembodied models of synthetic imagination, we should not shy from what the interdisciplinarity of machine learning and its related research might tell us about intelligence. Related in the sense that any research concerning cognition will be of interest to the mathematical conjuring of computer science, at least according to the melior est conditio possidendis of Kant's practical reason, since concerning claims about artistic production that are not in possession of sufficient information about the brain, their speculative invigorations about creativity and its spontaneous arrangements would be, as Kant would have it, the same as to play with thoughts, unless one merely has the opinion that an uncertain path of judgment can perhaps lead to truth. Because we should, when faced with certain objections, be free to use, as if it were in an emergency, the same means of adversarial deployment of analogy schema for our good cause. These are constructive hypotheses that Kant condoned as therefore allowed in the field of pure reason only as weapons of war. Yet there would be no need to dispense with them once the dust of battle is settled. And in a kind of Whiteheadian alignment with weaponized abstractions, cognitive performance alongside AI should be configured as akin to the statements made about the B-21 bomber that was revealed in 2022. That is, according to an open system architecture that is designed so as to be amenable to swapping weaponry in and out, with particular attention towards the anticipation of weapons that do not yet exist, providing sustainability to the model itself, or rather sustainability to practice as such, to reveal what Benedict Singleton has outlined as a project of insubordination, wherein cunning reason extrapolates and models environmental affordances, the environment no longer being merely that of nature, thereby, quote, commissioning an assault by practical reason on the things that bind us, irrespective of their historical ubiquity, end quote. Just as the coin might be used to scratch the lottery ticket, so might the bobby pin be used to pick the lock. Yet as far as intelligence is concerned, if one for any reason wanted to trust the advice of the CIA, we might not let the ego get in the way when we determine the best method for a given situation. After all, there's nothing wrong with drilling a lock to get it open, because labor is more expensive in most cases than product. Keeping in mind also that we only now have the drill, or the flipper zero as its analog in the computational era of authentication, because of cultural espionage into techniques, as is also the case with AI. While brute force may sometimes be the appropriate solution, it is no solution to understanding the mechanisms of the lock itself. This is why the loot has always been technique and not whatever objects have been constructed by a so-called unruly imagination divorced from constraints and rules as a definition of freedom. This is also why we should consider to what extent self-preservation might be more of the order of what technique tends to culturally give way to in its maintenance of the identity of art, than to any ostensible spontaneous guidance by fictive techniques that we do not understand, since what is at stake is not just what we understand, but how, and why new techniques are the only available means by which we can, even if the techniques must be stolen, have already been stolen by something or someone else. Just because we know how, insofar as it fits and turns, we can use a key to open the door doesn't guarantee or even assume any understanding of the mechanisms of the lock that could tell us how to pick it. A knowledge and skill acquisition that could prove very useful as a pattern generalizable across a class of locks, which might guard anything from our chains to passages leading inside the enemy's castle. That's all I got.
Thank you. Now we can open it up to discussion. I will note you can raise your hand to ask a question, and then I can call on you. And everyone, please turn on your camera if possible. I think the first hand that I saw was Ellis, and then Martin, and then Ali.
Am I good to go?
Yes.
Okay. Hey, Keith, thank you so much for that talk. It was very comprehensive. I think mainly I'm interested in getting into perhaps more of at least looking at a algorithmic decomposition for descriptive language that I think is relevant to what you're talking about, but in its specific regard to decomposing the language we use to describe imagination itself, with example to like, even that colloquially speaking, I would say that I'm thinking about a triangle, or I'm thinking about my trauma, or I'm thinking about nothing. And that is one of the ways in which we describe the act of imagining something, that it deploys a proximal adverb in the use of the term about. I'm wondering if there's etymological boundaries that are conventional terms for imagination dress a type of metatropic unifying gesture around the studies that establish, I mean, I suppose it's a restricted economy over the use of terms that have their own inferential relations. And if it forecloses modes of reading how we could talk or understand what imagination is or could be more speculatively. And I guess finally, in terms of the way in which you address something like speculation and creativity, are those already themselves foreclosed by, limits of technique? And so how are we able to think about a new type of intelligence or a new type of imagination by your own analysis here today if that also in itself requires the type of imagination and novelty that is constrained to picturing, resemblances, representations? I'm not sure if that makes sense. Bias towards our diagnostic abilities.
Well, thanks, Ellis. Sure, it makes sense, but it also makes sense as one of the problems that I'm still not sure precisely how to deal with. I mean, the interdisciplinarity here already posed enough of a methodological trap, trying to go across, cognitive psychology, cognitive evolutionary, archaeology, philosophy, art theory, image theory. They all have their own different understandings, right, of what an image or a picture is. Anthropology is going to tell you one thing, and art theory and iconographic studies and art history are going to say another. And then, of course, the problem of the whole general problem of imagination and whether or not we even have mental images at all remains an open question for cognitive science, cognitive neuroscience. And, there's a reason why it's been an item of, philosophical debate for 50 years or more. I mean, Pellichan's history is like, well, we should look at the past 300 years going back to problems that were, visible in British empiricism, say with Hume, and of course, obviously, it gets taken up by Kant in a different context. So I don't, I mean, I don't have a solution to whatever that set of problems are, questions are, but yeah, for me, it's certainly about like trying to be able to construct the bridges that can cross those sort of terminological disputes, and try to isolate what is a definition of what an image is or what the imagination is, because the whole our modern and contemporary notions of anticipatory models of cognition are not they're not per se alien to what Kant was trying to think about, but it wasn't considered in those terms, right? And already, like with evolutionary biology, we've been able to take this concept of exaptation, which was abandoned by evolutionary biology, and now is getting used by these other disciplines, technology studies, semiotics, linguistics, as a way to explain how we appropriate things from our context. So I don't know if this kind of gets towards what you're wanting to draw out of me in terms of an answer.
I think mostly it's that I'm wondering if you think that a new radically diverted or divergent like set of terms is required in describing intelligence, because the previous ones are already entrenched in such etymologies that have to do with like the mimetic relationship between images and what they image. But that's
yeah. I mean, we don't have that taxonomy.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Okay. Thank you.
Martin, would you like to ask your question or make your comment?
Sure. Keith, first let me say that the quotations and the illustrations were incredibly apt and often hilarious. And I loved your talk. I think it's really wonderful. And so I have a kind of long comment and then a question. So the long comment has to do with the relationship between imagination, creativity, and this question of perception and cognition. And I'm wondering how much Duchamp lies behind a lot of the ways in which you're thinking about this. And the reason why I say that is that as opposed to someone like Ezra Pound, who in the manifesto Make It New, that famous phrase by him, he simply reenacts over and over again basically the epistemology and the ideology of the Industrial Revolution and its fascist implications, of the male spermatozoid charging the female chaos and all that that's implied. Instead of making it new, you got Duchamp taking like a bicycle wheel and turning it upside down and calling it bicycle wheel, or the urinal turned upside down and called a fountain. Where he could be engaging in some really avant-garde and occult concepts, like with the bicycle wheel, Merkaba Kabbalism, as Jack Burnham had argued. Or you take a painting like The Bride Descending a Staircase, and what he seems to be doing is spoofing the very foundations of the epistemology and ideology, which not only Ezra Pound is wedded to, but also Marinetti, with a reference to Picasso, where he's spoofing both cubism and futurism at the same time. And I'm wondering where a repeated image, a seemingly uncreative image, can create dissonance in such a way where foundational assumptions are being challenged. And I'm wondering that even with what you're presenting, are all of these still dependent upon an autonomous, unified subject? And I want to point to another work by Duchamp, Étant donné, where someone goes through a darkened alley, really, off the main room in the Philadelphia Museum, and peers through pinholes and sees the scene, which one part of his brain, one part of the brain reacts viscerally, because that person is being confronted with a subject position of pornographic voyeurism, and yet at the same time, you have all these other points of interest in the tableau, which point to a completely different paradigm, one that he was writing about before World War I, and is suggested by people like Bergson and Poincaré, of emergence, which is a very different kind of paradigm from the epistemological and ideological foundations for the Industrial Revolution, where you have the irreversibility of the waterfall, the complexity of the gas lamp, and the womb, which is the site of morphogenesis. And there's a suggestion that Duchamp really got the sense that the cognitive dissonance is due to the fact that the brain is responding simultaneously as a multiplicity, and that the mind is not unified and autonomous, but is actually a multiplicity, and that he was deliberately creating a tableau to generate that dissonance between parts of the mind. And I'm wondering whether a view of multiplicity changes anything in your presentation, which I absolutely loved and thought it was incredibly rich and detailed.
Well, thank you, first of all. I'm not entirely sure how to respond to that, because it seems more of like its own mini lecture than a question, with the exception of the problem of multiplicity, which
Yep.
in that.
That's why I said a comment and then a question. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose well, look, I mean, what you're talking about is like a fairly specific art historical problem of Duchamp and his relation to that milieu, which I'm not sure how to per se align with my talk. I mean, the problem of the ready-made, however, is like, I think, a general problem of just, cognition, perception, and imagination. And like, you could align, if you wanted to, how Kant, or how Duchamp ostensibly approached Kant's problems in relation to the ready-made with some sort of, if you really want to detour it over into like the Salarzian problem of the myth of the gibbon, the fact that like we have ready-made perceptions, right? So fine. Multiplicity in this context, I suppose, in that relation to autonomy, problems of emergence. Well, I mean, I think what you're trying to indicate here is what's understood as the multimodality of cognition, rather than some sort of a Cartesian point or something like this. And sure, there's a way to, I think, articulate that, but like I'm personally not interested in the Deleuzian articulation of thinking. Because as I would hope to have communicated here, that there's a certain degree of polemic against how Deleuze and then Deleuze-Guattari appropriate problems of spontaneity and creative freedom, a la Bergson. But nonetheless, I would say that there are clearly still resources in Deleuze's thinking that can't merely be rejected on those ideological grounds, because I think he poses some very profound problems and challenges to the Kantian system. So, yeah, I hope that answers your question there.
This person, Adam Basanta, hints a little bit in which I'm describing Duchamp as someone who tinkers with the cognition of his audience, with his auditors, with the spectators of his works. That he's really messing with the foundations of their assumptions at the level of cognition as well as the level of ideology.
I mean, sure, yeah, we could hope so as an ambition that like they're doing that. I don't know, perhaps they still have that effect on people, but of course, like for those of us who are overeducated from art education, we kind of know what we're walking into. And so it's just not going to do that. But I think that, there is this capacity of art to continue to perform those kinds of manipulations, which I think is what makes it interesting and useful. Because we can't merely rely on, the theoretical sort of pontifications of philosophy and its problems to always like upend our sort of assumptions about the world.
Okay, Ali, would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, thank you so much, Keith, for your great presentation. My question is kind of in two parts, but I'll try to simplify it. So first, regarding the text that was from Dan Dennett's, he sort of separated imagination, I mean, at least to my understanding, into imagistic and descriptive forms. And I'm thinking about it more in the context of play, where these two become kind of one, where perception and action almost happen real time altogether. Of course, I mean, to give an empirical example, when you're playing a first-person shooter competitive e-sport game, in the beginning, you have no understanding of the mechanics and the rules of the game. And there's a cost to pay, of course, the cognitive cost of learning the rules, the new rules and mechanics and skills. And after a certain point, you start to enter this state of flow where you think rationally in that context. You map, you anticipate through the image you perceive, all in at the same time, kind of. So I was wondering, is this a new form when these two become one, or is it just we think that they're kind of synced in that sort of ludic play form? And yeah, the other question I had was kind of related to this, but also about the cognitive cost of these rules that we learn and unlearn and through play. And where in a speculative condition where we have too much different rules and games to play, where would that end up? Do we also end up with saturation of image that we have now with culture and art and aesthetics regarding to play, and saturation of rules and confusions with that?
Yeah, sure. I suppose first to the immediate second question there. I mean, this is, that's the problem, I think, of our impulses towards mimetic behavior, and like specifically regarding online behavior is like the real danger of all of these new tools and the social media platforms that I think I mentioned very briefly at the outset, that certainly have all of their negative consequences, and then all of the critiques that are emerging from there are like incredibly important ones. But again, that's not necessarily my problem, because it's a matter of like, well, if you can understand them in a certain way, then you can utilize them for something else. Which I think is why, towards perhaps your first question, is that like that relationship of the simulated environment according to rules is only new in the sense of the fact that you've got a controller in the game screen there. Right? The context there is different, but I think the procedures are the same as what forms of activity we've already been involved in for quite some time.
There is a comment in the chat from Philippe. I don't know if Philippe, if you'd like to read it aloud, or if that's not possible, I could
It is
read it
possible.
aloud.
It is possible. I just don't know if it's that relevant. I'm sorry, but thank you.
Please.
Listening to the talk, and this is a very dumping down of your talk, Keith. So I'm sorry. I couldn't help but be reminded of something that Ed Piskor or Jeff Barrow, I'm not sure which of them, in an interview, they said about their use of the Sakura micron pens, the really thin ones that are used for inking comics. One of them said that when the tips break, like 0.005 millimeter tips, when they break, they become a little feathery. And instead of thrashing them, like I used to do before listening to this, they started keeping them in order to use these pens for another sort of line drawing, used for which the pens were not originally designed for. And well, yeah, that's it. I was reminded of this, and I thought it was important, at least to me, as someone who draws comics, and I know you do as well, that because there's something interesting about comics who have a really strict form, as I say elsewhere many times, and exemplify this sort of the really strong way in which techne is linked to the imagination and vice versa. Thanks for here.
Yeah, thanks. Sure, I can address that out because I know about that. Sure. I mean, I use microns too, and I have the soft tip ones that are a little flayed and can be used for like a bit more of like a liberal technique that is closer to the sort of drag you get with a brush when it's not supposed to be that because it's an extremely technical tool. And there's the whole range of techniques and what you can do within inking is what makes it, I think, its own art form rather than just I mean, it's stereotypically assumed to be just tracing, but it's clearly not. But even comics in general, I think is extremely interesting in terms of its technical lineage and like how it approaches technique and forms of production. I think one of the best examples for me is how Frank Miller, when he was working on his Ronin series, was specifically trying to draw more shitty so as to retain techniques that were developed within shitty printing technologies that were erased by the innovation of Baxter paper and the development of new techniques. So there's that sense there in which what Steyrl identifies as the poor image within the domain of the digital is something that was already like, I think people who are involved in forms of production in relation to technology, whether it's digital or analog, are always like looking for how to kind of hack that system and do something to get the results that certain forms don't enable anymore, if that makes sense.
Antoine, would you like to ask a question?
Thank you. Thank you, Kate. It was a absolutely wonderful talk. Was a bit so I'll wrap the question maybe in two parts. The first is really kind of easy. Recently, I've been digging to the imaginal as a set of orientation of the imagination, and so I was a bit surprised not to see it inside your reasoning, or maybe it's yes. So that's the first question, and the second is maybe more deep. As a painter, I consider painting as a trans-dimensionalized cryptographic medium. So we encrypt 3D phenomena into a 2D surface, and then the 3D organism decrypt it. And so this is the relation to the surface. And so for this question, do you think that thinking with computers while we make pictures will enable us to deploy maybe like the next perspective, so to be able to displace the ontology and then perceive a elsewhere, or maybe it's not a where or an else, but maybe you see it.
Okay, well, second question first again. Sure, I don't see why not, whatever that might mean though, in terms of like an elsewhere. I mean, this is my ambivalence here is that we essentially have a new tool and there's things that we can do with it. So why not utilize it? In spite of how it seems to be ethically problematic, it seems like one of the most ethical things you can do is to actually just use it because it's there. And if it is indeed taking something from artistic creative thinking, what's the loot there? So like that's really my question, and that's sort of what drove me to kind of look into this problem in this particular way. In terms of the imaginal not being within the ambit of what I was talking about, I don't even know what to do with that yet, simply because this is such a complex problem that I've had to go into different areas that I was not even expecting to look into. So it's, how I've had to contend with problems in these different disciplines is it limits my purview and my ability to even consider other certain conceptual problems, and imaginal being one of them. So that's just as a practical reason for why it wasn't there.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to have any questions? Reza?
My apologies. My video is off. Magnificent, absolutely magnificent talk, utterly out of this world in terms of the sheer amount of ideas being delivered with drone strike precision. However, I think that you skipped. So I was, Keith, I was merely reading the essay that you shared with me as you were talking, and I noticed that you skipped a number of interesting points, actually, which I think somehow bring together my criticism of this essay. By this, I mean a belated criticism, precisely because there is nothing other than magnificence about this presentation. Right. The problem is very simple. And through private channel, we have been talking about that this text purports to be of a theoretical kind rather than philosophical kind. Right. That it is essentially not of a certain sort of philosophical attempt at resolving. But I would say, actually, it is fundamentally philosophical, and it is pure philosophicality. There is something or two missing here, fundamentally. And I'm going to say this. So I don't know, since for them, and taking a healthy amount of inspiration from Leroy Gourhan, as I no doubt have, there is no imagination outside of technique. Outside of technique. This is, yeah. I mean, I have philosophical issues with this statement, but nevertheless, let's take this as an axiom.
Okay.
Then there would be a different line. I think that you skip this, but nevertheless, I'm going to read it precisely because I really think that even if it doesn't exist in the text, it exists in a different spirit throughout the text. As archaeologist Colin Renfrew commented around the time of discovery of the Varna necropolis in 1972, the deepening of a skill will be coextensive with the embedding of social hierarchies, where in the case of the advance of metallurgy, techniques serve not the purpose of utility, but of conspicuous display, and by extension, as noted by Leroy Gourhan, so on and so forth, the peoples on whom we base our memories of the earliest days of modern society were aware of the ambiguous nature of the organism then just coming into being. It is not by change that the myth of Prometheus gives us both man triumphant over the gods and man shackled by the gods, or that Genesis speaks of the number of Abel by the farmer Cain, builder of the first city and ancestor of whatever the first metallurgist. Amen. So there seems
that was
to be
in the presentation.
It was. I maybe I was just like, doing something else. I missed it. Anyway. So the philosophical question is becoming a little bit interesting here. Precisely because you're saying that, well, this is theory. This is like, you're merely talking about imagination. And imagination and its relation with techniques, and there is nothing technical. There is nothing. I mean, that sentence that you say, what is it? My apologies. You say that there is no imagination outside of technique. I mean, this imagination, this statement can actually be interpreted quite differently. That there is nothing to imagination other than technique, but there is no imagination outside of technique, in a very different sort of aura, within a different sort of vibe. But regardless, it seems as if the whole essay has already put its mind on a resolved issue with regard to the locale, to the topos, to the birthplace of technique. Meaning that technique ultimately theologically becomes coextensive with social hierarchy precisely because the only technique there is a technique born out of polis, born out of a very specific, rather pigeonholed image of civilization, which essentially would be Greek-centric, right? But think about this. What about the desert nomads? Their techniques. They don't have any sort of idea of the polis, and hence no relation of between polis and technique, and hence social hierarchy. So the failure to think about an imagination that we could recognize, we couldn't recognize technique in any other sort of way outside of the social organization of the police would be in fact count as a failure of imagination.
That's cute, Reza. Thanks. Yeah, sure. I mean, we can talk more about this next week, but obviously, I wouldn't disagree there. I would say yes. Within the context of the world in which we live, this is the context where we need to think about how technique is both captured and developed and exploited without using the desert in the scenario, which I think you're correct about, as you know. Well, it seems to me that you're using it as like as a poetic sort of utopian expanse within which techniques can be
absolutely no, absolutely not. No, desert precisely in a very concrete sense of desert nomadism, right?
Right. Well, we've already talked about this a lot. I mean, so it's maybe it will be something that I would need to have to revise if I'm to write this further. How does the desert fit in? I don't really know, but my localization isn't in the Hobbesian state or polis. That's yours. So.
My apologies. No. I didn't mean that. But nevertheless, this whole idea that that imagination being understood in this sort of technical plenum, and then somehow the technical plenum is implicitly being associated with social hierarchization, that would have a flavor of the polis in it.
Well, this is a historical entrenchment, right? Not, but yes. But the social precedes that entrenchment, and I think that technique can only develop in that context of social interaction, right? Where it has to, right? Once self-consciousness arises, once it's possible to model one's own mind and the minds of others, then we have language and social interaction, which is prior to the formation of the polis, right? So
yes, but there is, in fact, I would say that there is an unconscious, which is at work against this sort at the background of this sort of ideas, meaning that any sort of ideas of technique that we usually think about today, even with regard to Métis, cunning, and craftiness, and so on and so forth, would be against the backdrop of always being in a very specific expression of civilization. And what is that expression of civilization? It is a built civilization. Might not be, in fact, a polis, but nevertheless, a civilization that only becomes a civilization by building something. Except that as Middle Eastern and African historians have noted, civilization, that idea of civilization as the Bildung, as that which builds, as that which imagines a final end material product, is not really the complete story of civilization. Civilization can also be understood as transmission of heritage, deep object, tradition.
Mm-hmm. Right, but there would nevertheless still be technique there, just not in the way that it's being defined.
Not in the sense that articulated, yes, unconsciously or so, or otherwise, with regard to the question of technique, social hierarchization, and the unconscious of all of these, which would be the Greek-centric understanding of politics, essentially.
Mm-hmm. Right. I'm not going to disagree with that.
There's also a question, I think, from Philippe. For a moment, I saw a hand. If you would like to speak, if not, I also see Adam.
Yeah, just to continue a little bit the technique development through polis or social organization. I mean, if we imagine a Homo erectus member of a tribe, they get separated from their social structure. One would imagine that if they survive, they have developed some sort of techniques, and that would be not in direct contact with a social organization, but with some sort of still reference to it, because if they didn't have any kind of notion of or cognitive schemas for technical development that they acquired socially, they would not survive at all, and then no technique would develop. So is there kind of like a maybe there's a place to split between Reza and yours position in terms of how technique does seem to require this kind of social organization, but it doesn't require only the social organizations that Reza felt were implied in the talk.
Yeah, I mean, whatever way there is to mediate this problem, I'd be open to considering. I mean, yes, of course, the whole talk was constrained in that sense, of course, especially in relation to Wartofsky's idea of an historical epistemology, where linear perspective sort of encodes this form of seeing, and of course, you get that with Churchland as well. But these are the things that, obviously, as Reza is saying here, is that there would be a way for technique to exist, because these forms of encoding there's no necessity to them. They're just there. So I think part of the point of trying to develop further techniques is first, in order to be able to see that the form of seeing itself is already this encoded form of seeing, and then to develop the technique that can find a different way out of it, outside of it, right? I mean, this is the philosophical problem of thought constructing an outside for itself that Reza was saying is sort of the implicit thing in here that is left to the sidelines because I'm giving this more, I suppose, a wide-ranging theoretical sort of argument.
There's a question from Devin. I can read it aloud if you'd like, or you can ask the question yourself if you prefer. My question, I guess, is similarly related to Reza's comments on the unconscious, insofar as phenomenology has succeeded in reducing or distilling consciousness in its processes or as a representation. How might this modify the understanding of imagination, where the distillation of imagination to technique perhaps covers over the multiplicity of simultaneous processes underlying cognition?
Well, I would say that, this is part of Heidegger's and Dreyfus's inheritance of Heidegger's problem in the existential phenomenology domain, and part of what Ryle is talking from the empiricist position of that kind of covering over of like what's actually happening underneath, right? And obviously, I think in the historical trajectory of machine learning and cognitive science as it became a science and discipline in the 20th century is concerned with a similar deconstructive move to see what else is happening inside of cognition. And of course, the pivot towards embodiment for e-cognition and the cognitive sciences is, I think, interested in those questions, of course, of trying to answer like what else is involved outside of a technique that we could simply articulate and say what it is that we do when we're doing it, because there's something involved in the doing that has to be explained and articulated in a different way that is irreducible to the the constraints of that system of rules. But the fact that there are rules involved in the application of know-how in terms of their heuristic encoding and within this underlying subpersonal multiplicity is, I think, why you can't necessarily just get rid of the bitter flavor of the rules that are there to begin with in the learning of the technique.
Adam?
Yeah, it was a second question, not a left raised hand. Thank you. You mentioned the idea of generative AI as a tool that to use and find new possibilities, but I was also very happy that you noted the similarity between the training process of an AI system and the way that we study art, which is I wish more people would acknowledge that a basic art education, even in a contemporary art school, which has a lot of theoretical concentration, is basically learning a corpus, analyzing it for constituting parts, and pastiche exercises in trying to get close to it, with your teacher being the adversarial GAN, I suppose. And at some point, theoretically, we're supposed, that knowing the rules allows you to break the rules. But in that sense, I feel the generative AI image making as a tool, the generative image part of it is maybe the least new thing about it. It seems like that's the kind of procedural variation on an idea or prompt is something that
right, art's been doing that quite
for a very, very long time, even though we call that originality somehow.
Yeah.
So what kind of directions do you see in generative AI image making or otherwise that you think is new, not just in terms of it's a better deployment of the technique, but it's actually offering some sort of paradigmatic shift?
Yeah, I mean, it's just too fresh to say what that is, other than to state the case for the fact that it like affords that as a potential. I don't have a curatorial sort of nose to the ground in terms of what like other artists are really doing with it out there to kind of like to gauge what the what the atmosphere is with that, and and then I would say that like it certainly is going to introduce a disturbance and then a new set of criteria for which we have to evaluate like forms of practice and what, right? I mean, this is the point. This is why I think it is of interest, because it really does kind of undermine a lot of our assumptions that even throughout the trajectory of what Amanda Beach refers to consistently as the critical paradigm of contemporary art, which is like the sort of, I guess the elaboration of post-conceptual practices within just the general atmosphere of artistic production is going to, be disturbed a bit by like what's going on, right?
Yeah, I wonder if it's almost coming back to what Martin was saying about Duchamp's urinal. Like there's no, it's not pushing technique forward, right? But it disturbs what art is and how we think about it, and then gets reintegrated into that, and so maybe AI is actually generative AI can offer the same sort of thing, not in terms of technical development at all, but just in terms of revealing some things we have been conveniently ignoring.
There's a question from Cosmos. If you'd like to speak, you may. If not, I can read the question.
Yeah, actually, my question is, I don't know how much related, maybe it's addressed more to Reza's comments. It's more historical because there were nomadic cultures that were dominating military, like the Caliphate, the Mongol Empire, the Turkic empires, and of course they have influenced a lot the Western culture, and I'm guessing modernity. So I'm wondering how much distinction we can draw between the polis and the nomad in our current cultural landscape.
I mean, is that a question for Reza or me?
Yeah, I guess it's more for Reza.
Yeah, maybe he wants to try to answer that. I mean, that's more to the side of what he's interested in. So,
No, I actually think that everything that I could actually talk about this topic, I have already said about this. But let's hear about Dr. Tilford. How do you actually think about this? It's actually a very great question. The gradient.
right. I mean, what's the
techniques?
Well, I mean, well, okay. Look, this clearly is going to just intersects with the arguments of Deleuze and Guattari versus the nomad versus the state.
Right.
So sure, we know from that text that there are different historical trajectories always competing against one another, and that these offer different sorts of opportunities for either escape or capture. However, I don't.
True. The escape and capture the dilemma. That's actually a very interesting idea. But I think that there would be a different sort of way to actually think about the entrenchment of the way of the steppe and the desert nomadism within the very edifice of capitalism itself.
Mm-hmm.
This is actually quite a very kind of a heavyweight political meme, right? That, do you see, kids? The capitalism was born out of essentially the entrenchment of desert nomadism in every sort of way. Monotheism, think about that. Techniques, trap setting, terrorism, you name it. So in that sort of a story, you might ask yourself, when does it actually, what would be the condition of possibility of such gradients? And once this condition of possibility being understood in the sense of, you know, understanding of how nomadism have been complicit, not in a Deleuze-Guattarian sense, in a concrete sense, actually, in the rise of monotheism and capitalism and messianism of singularity thesis, then what sort of techniques are being shuffled here between all these universes at the extreme of the spectrum? That would be actually interesting to think about it. And that would be a job of imagination, right? You need to also have techniques, but techniques are not sufficient to make an imagination an imagination. Sometimes you need to unimagine in order to reimagine. What could possibly go wrong? And we see it, you know, with essentially ISIS. You know, so many people have talked about it as the avant-garde of terrorism, with really complete, straightforward poker face reference to the avant-garde of art world. So you see, all these techniques of revolution, of insurrection, are just like, you know, moving in all sorts of directions in a very specific sort of conceptual landscape. And at that point, things are not so straightforward as we thought they might be.
Sure. I mean, there's a dark side to creativity, as it's said, right?
Absolutely.
I will read a comment, question from Devin. I buy the argument that we can distill salient features of the techniques of imagination, which is especially important in regard to the disenchantment of creativity. I guess, how then can we navigate, or do you think we can best approach this dynamic between these underlying rules and the content which is excluded from them? I think from the talk, you articulate that a renegotiation or reappropriation of the rules via acceptation is the way to approach this.
Right. I think that's what I have in mind for now. We'll see the further I get into this, should I choose to continue this direction of my research. If in fact I run up, you know, because running into these problems, such as the ones Reza is bringing up, well, you have to find a way to still argue for the same thing, or you have to abandon the gun because you're out of bullets and you start using your fists or something. But either way, right, it's a question of like, what are the techniques going to be that are going to get through the scenario, the problem at hand. And with respect to that, I think that the concept of exaptation has an extremely useful conceptual armament. You know, it's because it shows the extent to which cognition is not constrained to the artifacts of its own construction according to the rules that they, you know, instantiate, right? Which is why we can change theoretical systems, and why the recursivity of language is, you know, an infinite resource, etc. So, I mean, these are practical and theoretical problems. So, I mean, the solution always has to be on the horizon. It can't be at hand.
Would anyone else like to say anything or ask any questions?
May I?
Yes.
Thank you. So, as a way of finding consensus, maybe, what would be the result of considering exaptation itself the first symptom of self-consciousness, coming at this from a center Salarian position, where we accept that some rules are naturalized, and self-consciousness distills those rules into meta rules. But this happened. So, taking exaptation as the first symptom of techne becoming self-conscious. Do I mean this? I'm sorry. I hope I'm not losing you. Maybe I should stop here and hope this was cogent so far.
Yeah, I'm just not sure where the question was in that. I mean, I wouldn't disagree that that's the kind of the point of some of the research that I've looked at is like that's their claim that, you know, it is this exacted, you know, that the anticipatory functions of cognition, which are, you know, across the spectrum of non-human animals, in our case is exacted towards other forms of manipulation. It's like the capacity to construct cognitive artifacts, and the self is one of them. So I'm not sure what to, like, other than that I agree with that, I'm not sure what the question might have been.
The question, the part of the question with which I was hoping to look for consensus is that this, which I described, re-described, may have happened in many particular ways, hence giving some space for the particular exaptations of nomad cultures, of sedentary cultures, and so on and so forth, you know, because I really can't accept that there was only one instance of this historically, you know, and I think that, and well, this will not be a question for you then. I think that Reza would accept this.
Why do I always need to actually be implicated in every sort of crime?
You implicated yourself.
Okay. Yes, I would say that yes, it is not it is not it's not as if this led to certain sort of, or makes a paradigm for us merely by the virtue of its exemplifying a spirit, right? You know, the idea of the nomad and this and that. But I would say that I consider you to rethink in Keats' the spirit of thesis, to understand that literally when we are talking about nomads here, or the state, or the Leviathan, we are not talking about actually things, or estates, or individuals. We are talking about a highly compressed computational set of techniques, meaning that there is nothing to a nomad that the proper set of technique that allows it to function as a nomad. And there is nothing, as Hobbes would have said, there is nothing to the state, to Leviathan, other than a certain sort of sufficient numbers of ratiocinators, computers, right? Mechanisms which undergirds essentially the maintenance and survival and the end game of the state, nation state. So I would say that if you think about all of these computationally rather than historically, as we often make mistake, we can actually think about all of this in a fundamentally different sort of ways. And that's when we see that why is that nomadism is complicit, fundamentally. In fact, not complicit, would be the germ cell of today's leviathans. But that would require, that is not actually a political or philosophical, actually, sort of way to articulate about this. I would say that this is why Keats' presentation is magnificent, because it kind of point out this fact that, a state is actually simply being made by certain sort of nomadic techniques of the desert. And so as any sort of form of fascism. And this is not really an ideological understanding of how, for example, the desert thought in mysticism leads to fascism down the line, or Landianism, or that sort of stuff. But rather, it is really to understand simply how techniques behind images and ideas and intelligences proliferate, spill over, and fundamentally integrate down the line. Create singularity basins, in Vernant's term.
Would you like to make any final comments?
No, just, I mean, beyond thanks for having me today. I enjoyed the conversation. Happy to see you guys again for another session.